All right. Welcome everyone to this unexpected Scrapbooks event, hosted graciously by McGill Library. And I have the YouTube going on in the background of my stream. So I'm hearing an echo, and now I'm not. But we can even talk about how scrapbooks are an echo of memory through time, and get all wishy-washy about that later. But first of all, thank you very much to McGill for hosting this. Thank you all for joining us on YouTube. I am Allie Alvis. I am the curator of special collections at the Winterthur Library in Delaware. We honor and acknowledge the Lenape who inhabited the lands of Winterthur and what is today northern Delaware and Pennsylvania. Their descendants today include the Delaware tribe and the Delaware Nation of Oklahoma, the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape, Ramapo Lenape, and Powhatan Lenape of New Jersey, and the Munsee Delaware of Ontario. I'm joined by Jacquelyn Sundberg, who is the outreach librarian for rare and special collections at the McGill Library. And thank you again to McGill for hosting. You will hear more from Jacquelyn shortly, but before we get to the good stuff, which are the scrapbooks, just a couple of housekeeping notes. Firstly, if you would like to ask a question during this presentation, you will need to log into a YouTube account. But if you don't have a YouTube account, or if you can't remember your password or what have you, you can also send the question as an email to info@mcgill.ca. That's MCGILL.ca. This presentation is being recorded, so no worries if you have to step away early. We will be here taped for you to enjoy. You will, if you've registered, which many of you have, you will receive a link to the recording soon after the presentation. And with that, take it away, Jacquelyn.
Well, thank you. I will introduce myself a little bit more officially. So I am outreach librarian here at the McGill University Library Rare Books and Special Collections. I do a lot of things, as I think every librarian does. There's a lot that goes unwritten into the job description. Nods from Allie. And I also curate our cookbook collection, our culinary collections, and our children's collection. And I really did get a fun selection of curatorial responsibilities, I have to say. And I'm joining you from Montreal, where unfortunately, it's snowing. So everyone who is in the chat, some people have chimed in, it's also snowing elsewhere in the world today. So I feel and share your sorrow at spring snow. But I'm joining you from Montreal, and Montreal is an island, and right in the center of that island is our McGill University campus. And the campus is situated on lands that have long been a place of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous nations, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. And McGill recognizes these nations as the traditional stewards and custodians of the lands on which I sit today and on which all of us are gathering. So thank you everyone for chiming in on the chat from all over. It's really quite impressive to see where you're tuning in from, and Allie and I are getting a huge amount of joy seeing where all of the interested in scrapbooking are tuning in from. So thank you for that. So there's an introduction to me and where I am. We chose 4 scrapbooks today that are quite eclectic, different time periods, some mostly 19th century, early 20th century. And to start off, we're going to do one from our collection here at McGill. It's from our culinary collection. So it caught my eye when I was doing some teaching sessions earlier this year. And I'm going to put it up on screen. So I will share my screen so you can all see it. It's an unusual scrapbook. And if you are a contemporary scrapbooker, this is going to look quite unattractive to you. So this is the scrapbook in question. It is, well, quite large. If you see from my hand, it's quite tall. It is a scrapbook of recipes, actually. So if you have questions, as Ali said, you can put them in the YouTube chat. We're keeping an eye on it. If you have questions in real time, we'll try and answer them while we're talking, if we can. If not, we'll get to them at the end where we will have a bit more of a discussion period. So this first recipe scrapbook, it's a specific topic, and that's true actually almost across the board today, isn't it, Allie? It's each one has a theme. And this one, though, is an unexpected packaging. So this is actually a book that would have been used for the instruction of bookkeeping. So as you see there, it's a book that taught people actually a specific kind of bookkeeping, tablet bookkeeping. And what this person did was use it and its blank pages that actually are not quite as blank as one would usually expect in a scrapbook. But what they did is create a solid selection of pages, all of which are recipes, all of which are clipped from magazines, mostly women's specific and domestic publications. And as I went through, there's titles that I'm sure some of you will recognize. There's Good Housekeeping, right? This page actually, the Good Housekeeping Institute, is one of the very, very common sources in this scrapbook. So this book, each page is covered, whether horizontally or vertically. This person, whoever they were, was quite economical with their glue. They didn't fasten everything. They had no real concern with aesthetics, I have to say. Although the one concession to aesthetics is whenever there are images, it seems that this person was quite tempted by the color images in the publications at the time. So you'll see quite a lot of jelly molds, you'll see cake pictures, you'll see puddings, you'll see table settings like this charming one at the bottom. This book came to us from someone who was quite well known in Quebec culinary culture for a long time. Her name was Sœur Berthe, or Sister Berthe. Berthe Sans Regret was her name. And she was known partly because she came to prominence in the culinary world in the 1970s and 80s in Quebec. And she was actually a religious sister. She was a member of the Congrégation de Notre-Dame de Montréal. And she was born in 1912. This scrapbook is dates. Most of the clippings where you can find dates date from around the 1930s. And it's a small font, and I will zoom in on certain sections to show you in greater detail. But you can see that there's kind of, in the pages we've shown so far, there's a regularity. She seems to cut the same, and I say she because my suspicion is that it is Berthe Sans Regret. That's the assumption with this catalog, when we catalog this book, that it was compiled by her in the 1930s. There's a consistency in what she chooses to include. There is definitely menus. So this page here is a regular feature that was in Good Housekeeping at the time. And all of the recipes are actually submitted by different people. And it would have been a regular feature like Mrs. A. Hendrick from Summit, what is that? Summit Avenue, Cedarhurst. Someone from Massachusetts, someone from Iowa. If there's anyone from Iowa in the chat, you can chime in and see if you also would have made a sweet potato pie, because that's the recipe that was contributed in 1932. But this collection goes on for page after page. And it really is a testament to the different women's periodicals that were published at the time. So all of these selections so far, so far as I've been able to tell, are from either Good Housekeeping or Chatelaine. There's another one called the Women's Pictorial Review. And all of these that are dated are from roughly the 1930s. There's clues to where these came from in the paper and the typography. You can see the slightly glossy magazine papers, and when you touch it, as I am now with my lovely clean, dry hands, you can feel that slight gloss that magazine finishes had at the time. There's also other clippings in here. It is very, very, there's one theme. It's all food. It's all food. It doesn't deviate from the theme. But what I find really interesting about this one is also the layout of how this person compiled it. So they didn't waste any glue. And if I find the right flag, I'll show you what I mean. Here. Or we can pause for a moment and consider the banana along with the author. In the 1930s, it may have been a new ingredient to some households in North America. This likely originated either in Quebec, southern Quebec, or in the Northeast states based on the circulation of the magazines, but likely Quebec because there's also a fair number of French clippings that are included. And some that mention specific publications like La Presse, which is a Montreal-based newspaper at the time. And then one of the charming things is that they're pasted in, sometimes cut out like the lovely banana, but the way that the author has done it is to maximize space, maybe minimize glue, is she only glues the top of the page or the recipe insert. So you can see, you can flip it up and you can see that tablet book, the bookkeeping element underneath, which is not something you usually, in my experience, get in a scrapbook. And it's a really lovely example of recycling. But this one I flagged in particular because there's interesting damage as well. You can see right through to the next page, and that little peekaboo gives you actually an idea of what's on the verso, what the author didn't consider important. And it makes this visually kind of confusing object sometimes. You have to parse what was pasted in and what was written underneath. One of the questions that Allie and I were talking about is what the function of scrapbooks were. And I think that definitely changed over time. This one definitely has a single function. It's to document all of the recipes that this author found interesting, that caught their attention, the documented techniques, cooking techniques like this one here. Brown Bread Please, of course, by Florence Spring. Or sometimes they even included instructions on, for example, how to make sure your jelly will gel, which is quite important at the time. Gelatin is not as popular, and Jello-based desserts are not as popular today. There is definitely, in the comments, someone just mentioned the accursed aspic era. That is this era. Gelatin really took off along with some of these other soft culinary innovations in the 20th century. So one of the others that you'll notice in here is periodically Crisco will be mentioned by name. Jello will be mentioned by name. Some of these brands make it into the recipes. And they also give us a more concrete ability to date the recipe. So we know that this one is at least after 1920s because Crisco is mentioned by name. So one of the other things I'll just showcase here, if I can zoom in a little bit more, is that this compiler has also periodically annotated some of the recipes that they clearly have made. So the check marks are more common, but every so often there is a little annotation, almost always in French. This one says, bon, alors les macarons étaient bons. The macaroons were very good, apparently. And the author's hand appears periodically more towards the second half of the scrapbook. So that's my introduction to this book. I'll open it up to questions. Allie, if you have any, feel free. And if you have any from the comments, you can feel free to chime in as well. I'm just going to switch my view so I can see. The question one comes in from the crowd. I'll answer that, and then Allie, if you have anything to say, you can chime in. What type of glue do you think they used? And what glue is good for archival purposes? Some glue sticks these days aren't reliably adhesive. That's very true. This one, it's a guess. I'm not entirely sure what they would have used in the 1930s. This person, clearly, all I can really comment on is that they used it quite sparingly. They used it mainly at the tops to adhere the tops, and they didn't even, so on some pages, you'll have multiple things overlapping each other. Do you have any comments about glue? Did you do any research into that with your scrapbooks, Allie?
I haven't actually done like hard research into this, but at least in the sort of last half of the 19th century, you would have been seeing store-bought glue. This would have been glue that people went to the shop, they bought a bottle of, brushed it on with a little brush. In earlier scrapbooks in like the 18th century, that probably would have been some sort of hide glue or animal glue. But especially during the Industrial Revolution, that's when you get advances in glue technology. So it's no longer just made out of horse hooves and the same kind of stuff that gelatin is made out of, actually, which is a little strange. But yeah, it's very interesting to see how different kinds of glue age as well.
Mhm.
I frequently hear, like, God, what kind of glue did they use? It didn't yellow at all. And it looks like that is also true of the scrapbook that you have,
Yeah,
that,
for the most
it's
part,
not
yes.
brown.
It depends on the paper. So some of the newsprint clippings, if I can find a page with newspaper, the glue has yellowed on those pages much more. And in response to a question from the crowd, there isn't a clear date range. So here you can see this one dates from 1933. I haven't been able to find a specific latest date in here. Most of the dates that I did find were from the early 1930s. And if we look at Serbert's timeline, that was in the 1930s. She was entering religious life. She was clearly interested in cooking. She took this on more in the 1940s and 50s and had more formal education. And then eventually she actually took over the culinary arts department of the École supérieure des arts et métiers in Montreal. So that's a domestic arts and arts school here in Montreal. And she ran that department for 40 years. So this is her sort of formative book. And if you keep that in mind, it's from the 1930s, so earlier years that she clearly used and annotated more towards the end of the scrapbook. So probably mid 30s would be my guess towards the end. But we would have to take a microscope to all of the pages to see if we missed any end dates. Another question was
Yeah,
foods.
I was going to actually echo those because those were my questions. Has anyone ever tried to recreate any of these recipes? And are there any like food stains or evidence that this was actually used in the kitchen? Things
Well,
like that.
no, in this one it's actually quite clean, which is surprising. The As I straighten my camera, maybe just a tad here, the recipes, the only annotations and signs of use that we see are things like this, where you'll see either a pen or a pencil annotation with beau or bon or something like that, just a simple adjective, a check mark, or an X. And that's common but also uncommon. So people use their cookbooks and recipe scrapbooks differently. This was clearly compiled for a specific purpose as a reference document. So maybe I use a recipe compiler app. It's digital. That's where all of them live. This is the pre-digital version of that. And it's also a really interesting snapshot of the women's publishing and the food and culinary publishing that was available at the time. One of the interesting things is that Gourmet magazine, I didn't notice any references to Gourmet magazine, which is out at the time. And yes, more questions from the crowd. The colored photos are printed. They're clippings from magazines. They would have been chromolithographed prints probably at this point, or four color prints in the 1930s. There are some photographs in black and white, like you can see here. I do find it quite interesting how this person prioritizes what was interesting. So often I would find myself as I went through this book looking at the backside of the things that they included and saying, oh, what's behind the recipes? And flipping them up and saying, oh, that one didn't make the cut. So the hookah pipe was not interesting, but the Christmas pie was interesting. So, I mean, everyone has selection principles. And we'll see that even more in the other samples of books that we will look at. I think that's probably all the time we have for this one. So we should move on. I will stop my share to Allie and you can take over.
All right. Well, you will probably see some similarities and some differences between the scrapbooks that we have selected. Let me make sure everything is all centered here. So again, this is a little bit of an unusual format. Like this is about the size of my hand. Let me just oh yes. Alt tab.
Looks good.
Yeah. So this is called Geraldine's Scrapbook of Dresses. And it is very descriptively named, very sort of humble on the outside. But this is part of Collection 50, which is not very evocatively named, which is an assembled collection of material relating to textiles in the Winterthur Library. It includes dozens of fabric sample swatch books, historical dye recipes, weaving manuals, even commemorative ribbons, and the earliest materials in the collection date back to the 17th century. It also includes 6 examples of a very specific type of scrapbook, of which this is one, the sewing diary. So, as I said, this is Geraldine's scrapbook of dresses, kept by her mother, Ella Brown. And it is labeled here. And you turn the page, and it is an assembled book of fabric swatches labeled by Ella. Some of these are grandmother Jenkins before 1850, this brown one here. Other brown, this sort of grayish one. Um, and this records the dates basically of Geraldine's childhood and young adulthood, dating back to 1889 and running up through 1904. In this period, the Brown family lived in Newton, Massachusetts, and they were supported by Father J. Merrill Brown's work as an architect. So this family was sort of middle class, middle of the road. These were not extremely wealthy people, but they weren't sort of poor either. And as I mentioned, the first swatches are from Geraldine's 2 grandmothers, another female relative, and Ella herself. So one of these is actually, yeah, this is Ella's own dress. After this page, we get into Geraldine's early childhood. So Ella is noting basically what the designs are that she used to create Geraldine's dresses, and including actual fabric swatches of the dresses that were made. She also notes things like prices per yard of the material, and where Geraldine wore these dresses. So you can see some of them are just absolutely charming. This one actually has a little bit of writing underneath that notes Aunt Harriet helped finish this. So it's a really interesting sort of dress genealogy. And it situates this in a family tradition of saving and recording mementos of apparel. We keep going, we see more little dresses, and I will come back to these.
As you flip through, can I preemptively ask a question?
Yeah.
I too keep a sewing diary. I'm a sewist myself, and I could relate to this so well. And I'm so curious as to how the same question that that people asked me: how are these scraps affixed? Are they glued or are they actually stitched to the page?
So in this example, these are glued. We do have examples where they are sewn through the page, and you can kind of see like stitching at the top. But very much like the cookbook scrapbook that we just saw, these are glued at the top. So
Yeah.
these are all just a little bit loose. And you can see occasionally a little bit of browning coming through with that glue, but generally it's stayed pretty fast. But as you can see here, we have not just fabric samples and dresses, but Geraldine herself. So this is a tintype of Geraldine as a 4-year-old child wearing one of the dresses recorded by her mother. I believe it is this one. So you can see there are some differences between the dress as it was actually worn, the dress in the picture, and the fabric that we have here. And it's a great illustration of how colorful the past was. We see a lot of, black and
Absolutely.
white photos.
Could you zoom in? And well, we had a request. Could you zoom in on the photo to see on the
Yes.
left, if possible?
You. Sorry for making everybody motion sick. Don't know if it'll focus.
Maybe back
Yeah,
a little bit.
I know this is kind of low tech. But the
You can
wonderful
reset. We
thing,
get the idea.
yeah, reestablish this. The wonderful thing about this scrapbook is that it's been digitized. So if you want to linger on any of these pages, you can just head to contentdm.winterthur.org. And that's winter like the season, THUR.org. And all of these pages have been scanned, including the photograph. So you can sort of see it at a higher resolution and take in all of these really interesting details. Let me recenter this. There we go. But this is captioned. Yeah, maybe if I just hold it up.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah. Uh, Point of Pines, August 6th, 1891, 4 years old. So she wore this dress in 1891 at 4 years old. Ella paid $2 per yard for this fabric.
It,
Um,
it gives you an interesting economic record too of the cost
yeah, yeah.
of clothing. Because I noted as I flipped through, and we'll see on some subsequent pages, um, that there are dresses not only for her daughter, but there are also like adult dresses in this book as
Hmm.
well, right?
Yeah. So yeah, as I mentioned, the prices are there. There are illustrations of dresses, the fabric, and she doesn't actually say in the book where she gets the dress patterns from, but clever researchers have traced many of them back to a periodical called the Delineator. This is a journal published by Butterick Publishing Company, which will be a familiar name to sewists out there. It is the very same company who publishes sewing patterns today. So the Delineator started publication in the later 19th century, and it is full of garment ideas, instructions on how to make them, and they also sold patterns. So you can see this one is figure number 295A. And in Geraldine's scrapbook, there are these little figure numbers underneath these dresses. So these dresses were probably, Ella probably bought these patterns from a periodical or from a catalog like the Delineator to create these dresses for Ella. As we go through, I love this teeny tiny one. And there's an example of the glue bleeding through. Um, so in many of the early entries, Ella is recording these prices per yard of the fabric, but later on she stops. And there's no apparent reason why. It could indicate a change in economic situations. It could just be that she stopped recording them for no particular reason.
Can you see
Um,
the page turning?
yeah. Oh, yeah, because there's a lot here.
Yeah. And
And yeah, some of these notes finished December 16th, 1892. Brown goods from Leela, waist and upper sleeve of light feather stitched with yellow. So she's not just recording the dresses that she made, but sort of notes on the embellishment, the construction, any alterations. Here we have these fantastic late Victorian puffy sleeves. One can only imagine what a pain those would have been to make. Um, so swatch books like this really have their roots in the 18th century. The first fabric swatches that is around when they appear. Obviously, not everything survives from that period, so there may have been fabric swatches in books earlier, but that's sort of the first attested find of a fabric swatch in a scrapbook. But dress diaries like this became a more established format of a scrapbook in the mid to late 19th century. Um, so like this is a transitional period for fashion. As you saw, those big puffy sleeves, still evident here. We're in 1893 now. But as you go through, you see changes in fashion, changes in the types of clothing that Geraldine is wearing as she becomes an older girl. We have, see, these are just sleeves. These are no longer puffy sleeves. And this is 1900 and more of this fantastic lace. Um, so not only that, but more garments were being mass produced and were available off the rack in this period. Obviously, not everybody was going to the department store and buying dresses ready made. But something that is not recorded in here are undergarments. So there's an implication there that maybe the family was purchasing these from a shop. Maybe it was just a case of decorum. She didn't want to record the under things that she was making. But, you know, it's this interesting sort of period in the consumption of fashion and textile that a lot of these fabrics are now machine made. They are cheaper than they ever have been before. You can buy lace. Like lace was subject to sumptuary laws in the 16th century. It was just colossally expensive. And now it's affordable enough that someone can save a scrap of it and paste it into this book as a memory of the dress they made. So as I mentioned, yes, the scrapbook has been digitized. You kind of lose some of the textural elements though in the digitized copy. Like here, you can see this is kind of like a coarser weave and almost a metallic thread here, sort of silky. Put that back down.
It's interesting too because you get a sense from these scraps. They include not only the fabric but the trim, the rickrack, the
Mm.
ribbon, the lace, and I as I went through, I put the link to the digitized copy in the chat, and I invite everyone. You can browse those pages for yourself and click through these images. Um, Even though you can't flip up the fabric scraps in real time like Allie's doing. But I found it interesting too because it gives notes on the construction, like what the yoke of the shirt will be made out of, or what the waist, the shirt waist, and the different elements of the garment were made out of.
Mm.
Yeah.
I think it's so nice too how almost every dress Ella is saying Geraldine wore this to whatever.
Mhm.
And I mean, we met Geraldine in at age 4 in the 1890s, and now it's 1903, and this is her graduation dress.
Beautiful.
So yeah, and it's this really very light cream over pink
Yeah.
with this machine-made lace.
A
And then
question comes in for you, Allie. Do you see or do you know, is there any evidence of this being used as reviewed regularly? Do you think this would have been made mainly as a reference for internally, or would this have been shared? More of a commemorative object or more of a showpiece? Would it have been that kind of serve that function?
yeah, so this is interesting. This was created sort of over the years. It wasn't made all at once, sort of as a retrospective. It was like an active record of Ella's creation of these things for Geraldine.
Mhm.
And as you see in the sort of outside of it, it has seen better days. But this is not the original spine. So this book was conserved before it came to the Winterthur Library, possibly by Geraldine herself. She may have taken it somewhere to be repaired, possibly by the bookseller who we purchased it from. But it was in a very sorry state at some point. This would have been purchased as a blank book, sort of like a notebook that you can buy at Walmart or Target or wherever fine notebooks are sold. But this would have been a very sort of flexible format, but also made fairly cheaply. This is not the world's fanciest blank book.
Mhm.
So it may have fallen apart just as a result of the acidic paper used to make it. it may have fallen apart as a result of Geraldine sort of going back through it and remembering the dresses that she wore, or Ella
There's
referencing
also a
this.
fair amount of bulk that's added by all of the
Yes.
fabric samples. So that's quite
Yeah,
hard on a binding.
I know. So you can see like it's pretty narrow here and it's almost twice as wide in the back. So yeah, originally this would have been, much thinner. And this is actually an interesting illustration of, pretty good conservation, that they have left enough room for the pages to swell and for all of these fabric samples to be in there without being crushed to death. That may be part of the reason why it was in such a sorry state at some point, because the pages were much thicker than the binding was made to take. So it just sort of became swollen over the years, and eventually the spine gave out.
Right.
Um, yeah,
It's actually a good point of transition to the next scrapbook, if that's all right. Um,
absolutely.
the next one is an example of a very fine, high quality binding. It's really a showpiece. So we'll just adjust my camera so you can't see the quite as much of our lovely orange carpet. This is the next book that we had from the McGill collections. And this one, you can see stamped in gold on the front, is Laura B. Thompson, the name of the compiler. And this one is I'm not sure actually if it's the original. I think it is. I'd have to look back at our catalog record and notes, but I believe it's the original. So Laura B. Thompson is the creator of this one. And this is a book that is made specifically like that one, a blank book made to be filled with the creator's chosen works. And this one dates from around the same time. It was created in 1895, so a comparable time. And the creator at that time, she was born in 1878. What was Geraldine's birthday again? Almost the same. Anyway, the same era. So when she created this book, and she was about 18 years old, and this book is a bit stiffer in the binding, and the paperweight is heavier. So it does tend to stay open. It's had a little bit of humidity over time, so you'll see there's some speckling like this area, but it's in pretty good shape now. And this one is a little bit different than both of the examples. So what this one is as I turn pages, you'll see, it's really a sample book as well, but a sample book of all of the different crafts and projects that this young woman wanted to showcase. So the first of these is what was not necessarily called origami or by her at the time. It's simply called paper folding. And these squares of folded paper, I was just fascinated by it when I first saw this object. So I chose it and wanted to share it just because it's inspiring. But also because there seems to be an underlying logic and structure to the way that these pieces are showcased. And there's an entire section of this paper folding. And if I zoom in perhaps a little bit more, you can see the three-dimensionality. So each little square has these ridges. And yes, somebody just popped in that it reminds you very much of quilting shapes. Yes, and you'll see that even more throughout the book. So in our catalog, this is actually partly described as a quilting scrapbook for a couple of reasons. But this paper folding is the first section. And after this, it goes on to another form and practice of craft. The next one is, as you see here, very nicely handwritten headings. And this one is called paper interlacing. And less colorful, perhaps more complex. These are folded strips of paper that are folded lengthwise like this, and then folded again to make these geometric patterns and shapes. And I've never actually seen this particular craft before. And I learned quite a bit more about it as I went down a bit of a rabbit hole learning about this book. And it turns out that all of these activities, mat weaving, paper folding, the paper interweaving, they all flow from a theory of education that was popular and gaining ground at the time, that was popularized by Friedrich Froebel. He started the kindergarten movement. And in that movement, the kindergarten philosophy it was very much a philosophy of education. It was spiritual and mental, but based quite a bit on specific things that Froebel called gifts. And then there were occupations that students did with the gifts. And the occupations are actually these things. So paper mat weaving was one of the occupations in the kindergarten movement. And these, look at them, they're stunning. The color is beautiful. They are interwoven mats of paper. And this, you can see actually, for any of you who are weavers, you can see the logic that's being worked out in these patterns. So you'll have like, what's a good one to actually analyze? This one is a simple like 1 by 2 by 1 by 2 by 1 by 2, and then a 2 by 1 by 2 by 1 by 2 by 1. And you can see that they work out twills, they work out herringbones, and it's a really tactical understanding. Froebel's theory was that these particular activities had four specific fruits. So students who worked on mat weaving would learn about geometry, they would learn about symmetry, they would learn about color and patterns. And all of these activities had a very specific educational goal and function. And Laura B. Thompson was studying to be a teacher. And she went on to teach kindergarten in the Toronto area of Canada. And then eventually she became perhaps better known through, oh, there's a nice one. I like this blue and white. So yeah, somebody in the chat just chimed in that you made them in the 1970s in kindergarten in Germany. Froebel stars are still popular Christmas decorations. Yes, very much so. So his movement was influential. It took over, it gained popularity in North America and across Europe as well. And this, I think, my theory, not yet confirmed because I couldn't confirm where Laura Thompson actually did her teacher training, but she did work as an educator in Toronto and then moved up to the Yukon Territory in northern Canada, where she met her husband, and she later had a son who became quite well known in Canada. She met and married, her husband was who? Francis Burton, I believe. I think. And her son, Pierre Burton, and her daughter, Lucy Burton, were born when they lived up in the northern parts of Canada. Look at that purple. My goodness. The mat weavings are lovely. But her son, Pierre Burton, went on to become a well-known journalist and writer in Canada. And I'm going to continue page turning as I talk here. This one, through one error, you can actually see more of what's underneath. You can see the horizontal pink strips beneath the gray. But it allows for such endless creativity and crafting. So yes, somebody, whoever, Sarastra in the chat, I agree. Such a value on creative activities. The next section also flows from Froebel's kindergarten theories and occupations, and this one is sewing. And what this initial sample book, it lines up almost perfectly with the linear sewing objectives in Froebel's education manuals. And I found a couple of those and just cross references. So what he called for was actually that students, they would be given these perforated pages and they would have to practice vertical lines of one space like this. They would have to practice vertical lines of two spaces like that. They would have to practice, and it goes point for point. This is like a curriculum showpiece. And it's interesting because while it worked, she got a much better paying position in the Northern Territories in Yukon, and she became the director of kindergarten up there. But this book showcases all of the different skills that she mastered and then was fit to teach others. So you can see how the patterns get more complex. You combine horizontal and vertical lines first, and then eventually you add in diagonal lines and forming curves as well. But the patterns are amazing. And some of the other events that we've done here at McGill have been very focused on fibers and fiber crafts. And I came across this book in preparing for one of those events. So there you see, she gets into the diagonal lines. And yes, these perforated sewing cards, they're all standard. And one of the things that really makes this book stand out as a showpiece is how perfectly arranged and laid out they are. They are symmetrical. They're mounted most often by being, if they're the sewing cards, they're sewn to the page rather than glued like the paper folding crafts. And this one, some of the glue has lifted on a couple of the paper folding activities. I'll keep flipping because the last section, whoever mentioned quilting, they get more complex as we go. Here, we'll skip a few pages. You can see on some of these pages that the color of the cotton yarns has transferred. You can see the imprint of the opposite page. But the yarns themselves and the threads used are very color fast. And they get more and more complex. In response to a question whether this one's digitized, the answer is not yet. We can put it in our queue and our lab will work on it. Because some of these patterns would be great to serve as inspiration for your own projects. Here's one that actually has come loose, which is a fun moment because we can see the back side of the embroidery, which is quite as regular and perfect, I have to say, as the front. I wouldn't like to show the inside of my projects. I wouldn't like, I wouldn't make that public display. And the way that she set this one up, she didn't intend it for that either. But I will flip forward a little bit further to the section here. Getting towards the back of this thick book. But this section is paper cutting. So beautiful examples of her creativity, mastering principles of design and layout, symmetry, angles, and all of the above. And some of them are just so lovely. They would make excellent fodder for a quilt. If anyone has the skills and and the inclination, when we do get this digitized, we will shout it out on our social media and the links will be publicly available, but it will take a little while. Does anyone have questions that I haven't necessarily covered yet?
These would also make like really great wall decorations, like framed pieces.
Absolutely.
It's so much fun looking at this. We're running a little low on time. So
yes. So we can switch over.
gonna...
Next one on the docket, and then we'll see if we have some time for questions. I'll stop my share here.
Okay. Sorry to hijack it. I love those paper cuttings. I wish that I could have that kind of skill and patience. So as you will notice with this scrapbook, it is in this really fantastic, colorful binding. So this is a scrapbook that was made to be a scrapbook. This was a blank book sold as a scrapbook. But unlike Geraldine's scrapbook of dresses, this doesn't have a title. It's just Folio 288, which again, not very interesting, but that really disguises the fantastic treasures within. We start with some blank pages, which I feel builds up anticipation. This is another book that has recently been conserved. It used to be in many pieces. So we come upon this pretty little border and we think, oh, that's interesting. Okay, why is this here? Because this is a paper house. This is called a collage album. And this is a kind of scrapbook that became popular again in the later 19th century. But it never really achieved the same level of popularity as, you know, your average run-of-the-mill scrapbook. We don't know anything about who made it. The book itself was purchased in Salem, Massachusetts, as I said, purpose made for scrapbooking. And this whole album is created of images cut out of magazines, catalogs, periodicals, as well as wallpaper samples. So this floor and this sort of decoration on the ceiling, those are both wallpaper samples. There's a little bit of textile here on the bottom of the couch. And each page is a little bit different. And it's kind of hard to see. Love this bookshelf
Mhm.
from this view, but each page is labeled on the back as well. So this is the library. Go figure. Um,
You can peek through the
so
door. Is that what I'm
yes,
understanding?
that is one of my favorite parts about this scrapbook, and it's not on every single page, but many of them have this doorway or window that you can peek through to the next room. So
Wow.
I think this is my favorite page. It's just so rich and so delicious. And you can really see the multimedia art going on here because this is tissue paper. This is sort of a velvety, textile-y, textured flocked paper. And then we have wallpaper in the background.
These
Um,
cuttings, the furniture and images, do you know where these would have possibly been sourced from?
yes.
Perfect.
So something in common with this book and with Geraldine's dress diary is that many of these illustrations came from the delineator. So that really goes to show sort of how influential and how ubiquitous periodicals like that were. It also implies a sort of womanly female creator because these were women's publications. These were targeted specifically at mothers and young girls and women in the house making crafts, making clothing, working with household items, cooking, decorating. And it just is page after page of these wonderful interiors. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. I love this checkerboard floor to this page, which is not, crazy interesting, but
Allie,
stand
could
up.
you shift the book just slightly to the left?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that'll do.
All right.
Thanks.
So this is a book called Needle and Brush. And it's basically republications of material from the delineator. And an eagle-eyed researcher spotted this here.
Ah, that's the sound effect you wanted, right? What?
Yes,
There you go.
exactly. I know it's so cool to see, the thing in its original context. It's lambrequin for a table. So you can also see a lot of creativity going on here with the scrapbook maker because they've used it as a window shade.
Yeah. So
And
this also gives you more of a concrete date timeline for this book?
exactly. So it's definitely 1880s, 1890s. Um, because
Wow.
in this period also there was just a lot of publishing going on. So these periodicals went out of date fairly quickly.
Yeah. This makes me think we have one item in our collection that was actually like a type, the catalog from a printer. And they would have this, it was
Ah,
called a catalog of cliché gravure. So they'd have all of these images of engravings like these just compiled in a giant book. And I was like, oh, I'm sure that somewhere along the line, people used books like that one for purposes like this.
hmm. And a lot of these lamps probably came from a trade catalog, like a sales catalog. You can tell that they're printed just a little bit differently. But the different kinds of wallpaper also speaks to the industrialization going on. That wallpaper used to be a luxury. Now it is able to be cut up and put in children's um, experiments. And you may be asking yourself, like, why this? Why is it in the form of a house? Why isn't it just, a scrapbook? And it may make more sense when I tell you that collage albums are frequently found with paper dolls tucked inside. This
That
one
was
was
going to
not,
be my
unfortunately.
question. Yeah.
Yeah. But so these are paper houses for paper dolls. And that is an interesting point. We received a question sort of before we began broadcasting about how these materials were printed, the availability of colorful paper, things like that. In this period, paper dolls were becoming much more of a viable toy because color printing was much cheaper than it ever had been. People were really encountering colorful pieces of paper in volumes never before seen in human history because it was produced in huge numbers specifically for projects like this. Not necessarily the wallpaper, but the paper dolls. And you see just this explosion of creativity once people have access to these colorful resources. Um,
Someone just
but this
commented, and I
fake
think it
wood
bears
floor.
repeating, that this is a pre-Barbie dream house.
Yes, absolutely.
So thank
This
you, Callie Flower.
this is fun. It's an issue of Harper's Bazaar for some
Ah,
reason mounted on the wall. Um, and this is like a box of cards. It's just like every page is so fantastic.
I mean, the practice of collage art and collage albums,
Mhm.
it's not dead. It's not something that was
Yeah.
lost in the 19th century. People still practice this. And in
This is
fact,
the sewing room with the Victor sewing machine and all of these really interesting little projects around. Like Geraldine's scrapbook, this one is digitized. This is, as I said, Folio 288. So if you search on Content DM Folio 288, this will pop up. This
I
is
did
fun.
send out the link in the chat, and I'll repeat that we will send out the links to the digitized resources and the catalog links and our access instructions for both collections, because one of the questions, Allie, was, can we see these things? Um,
Absolutely.
right? And the answer for me too. So if you're in the Montreal area, come to McGill, send us an email. It's rarebooks.library@mcgill.ca. And you can ask about what we have. And we can set up an appointment to come. We're open Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. And I'll let you tell about where you are and how to come see these things in person.
Yeah, so if you're in the Philadelphia/Wilmington area, Winterthur is just down the road from Wilmington in Delaware. You can email reference@winterthur.org. And again, it's pronounced Winterthur, but it's spelled Winterthur. So don't forget that TH in there. But we are open Monday to Friday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. We just ask that you email us 24 hours ahead of time if you would like to make a special collections appointment. Our whole catalog is online. It hasn't all been digitized, but you can access it online. It's called WinterCat.
Well, that's
One
perfect.
word. I know, isn't it? It's actually easier to get to if you Google WinterCat rather than clicking through 87 million links on the Winterthur webpage.
Yeah.
But it'll be right there in the top results.
Yeah.
And something exciting that Winterthur is doing coming up is an exhibition called Transformations. And that's going to be opening in the early summer, and it's going to have a whole section devoted to scrapbooks. There's going to be this really interesting sort of animated um, scene of scraps flying around. There will be quote unquote scraps that you can use to make a scrapbook page on the wall. And it's an exhibition all about sort of reinterpreting your classic museum and library collections and making them interactive and fun.
That sounds like I'd like to pay a visit if I can manage
Absolutely.
it. We are coming to the end of our time. Thank you so much for sharing these with us and with everyone who's tuned in. And thank you, everyone who's tuned in. It's been a very active chat. I'm sorry if we haven't managed to answer all your questions. We are happy to answer them. If you want to send us an email, if you have questions about the collection, about further things that we didn't get to, about the colors in the wallpaper, whether they use pencil crayons, whether they use pens, all of these are great questions, and we'd love to keep the conversation going. I know I'm speaking for you, Allie, but I'm sure that you agree.
That is accurate. Yes. Happy to answer any questions. And as I mentioned, Winterthur has hundreds of scrapbooks and scrapbook type materials, as well as a huge collection of the ephemera used to make the scrapbooks. Uh,
Yeah. We had
Yeah.
one question come in advance. Do you want to? We'll sign off very shortly, but is there anything in the advanced questions that you wanted to touch on that you didn't get to? You can have the final word now.
Well, I mean, the questions about sort of the creation of this material and the availability, this would have been sold in like stationers shops. If you can talk for like 5 seconds, let me get
I
an
can.
incredible thing.
Yeah.
Um,
One of the questions that came in advance was about the way that the market for scrapbooking and for how marketing and the industrialization process changed the practice of scrapbooking. So Allie's grabbed something to show us. What's this one? This
so
looked
this
familiar.
this is a classic scrapbook
Yeah.
full of chromolithograph, just dripping with Victorian-ness.
Yes.
Um, but each one of these individual little pieces of paper would have been sold individually. So this is someone going to the stationer, going to the shops, buying sort of thematically appropriate things and arranging them on a page, sort of like Pinterest or Instagram.
Exactly. And it's also a precursor of all of the options available to scrapbookers now. Whether you
Yes.
have a die cut machine or a Cricut machine, you can create your own things, or whether you invest the money and buy all of the materials and practice this contemporary version of scrapbooking that we know now. Or wow, this is overwhelming. It's like
I
there's
know.
no empty space on my
Yeah,
page.
they used up every inch of paper here.
We have a number of other scrapbooks in our collections as well. And we do invitation from the both of us to come and visit the collections or to send us an email and connect about interest in them and the digitized holdings that are available. You should
Yes,
put this
please.
on the screen as oh say
These
something.
horrific, terrifying Victorian Santa Clauses.
Oh,
Let's
well,
go
don't
back
worry,
to the
the police
flowers.
are going to arrest Santa, so it's fine.
Yeah, apparently. And there's nice little Victorian kitty cats too.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we will sign off there. It's just after 1 p.m. Thank you everyone for joining us. And oh, kitty cats nestled in the flowers.
I
Yes.
know, it's so cute.
Well, thanks again, Allie. And we will say goodbye
Yes,
from
thank you
Michelle on
to
my
all
part.
of you all around the world for tuning in and enjoying this with us. And we hope to hear from you soon.
Okay. Okay, and